All right. And so if you're willing to, like I said last time, not required, since this is not an online course, so I hate to require it when the only reason we're online is because of me. If you're willing to have the video, it's great, makes it a little bit more conversational. If not, that's fine. And then just have yourself on mute when you're not talking, and that way we won't get any feedback. So let's start out first and just see, does anyone have any questions or announcements? And then I've got a few quick things that I want to tell you to make sure we're all on the same page. Feel free to raise your hand or just jump in. Okay. All right. Things that I want to tell you, and then you can ask me if anything comes up. First, I will email out all the final project ideas that you sent in. I will actually, I already put that up on Brightspace, so you can take a look. By Monday, look at it. You don't have to rank them yet. You don't have to make any final decisions if there's something that you want to switch over to. All I want you to do is take a look at what people came up with and see what interests you. On Monday, I will project it on the board and we will go through and start to cluster them together. I'll see which ones are most popular, and I want to start to get into 4 or 5 clusters. So that is the plan for Monday. Take a look at the list. If you have not sent your suggestion in, normally I would not be taking late work this far into the semester unless you had an excuse, but I was out this week, so things were a little bit more confusing. Submit that by Monday. I will still give you credit, and because I want to get that list on the board. We will be reading from a book by Jack Halberstam that is called Female Masculinity, and we are reading the introduction to that book. So that is the plan for Monday. Relatively short reading. Take your time, try to understand it. If there's parts that are confusing, highlight those parts, and that's what we'll talk about. We will also have a quiz next week. I'm thinking Wednesday would be more fair instead of Monday, simply because that's the first day back in person. So we'll have a quiz on Wednesday. On Monday, that's a great chance for you to tell me if there's anything that confuses you. So that's where we're at. That's the plan moving forward. Any questions about that? Cool. All right. So last time we have moved through the 3 most dominant models for studying masculinity within the social sciences. We have hegemonic, we've got inclusive, we've got hybrid. If you move beyond sociology and you move over to gender studies, and especially queer theory, then you start to see more of an appreciation of affect. That is what Clifton and I are drawing on. We're the exception within sociology. So we'll try to make sense of that today. It's a little bit more confusing. And then next class, we're reading from the book called Female Masculinity. I'll spend a little bit of time before we get into that reading, lecturing on the influence of queer theory on studying masculinity. So that's going to add a 5th little approach that overlaps with what Clifton and I are doing. So there's really 4 approaches. I'd say a 5th one is that thing I mentioned to you before called Manhood Acts. I didn't assign it because I'm not a fan of it. And then the other reason is it had a moment of popularity in around 2010 or so, but you don't really see people even citing it anymore. So it had this like brief moment and then disappeared. I might try to find time this semester just to read it because it could be useful as you do your some of your papers, your field work. So we might return to that. I still haven't decided on that one. I already have it on Brightspace if you want to take a look at it. But the dominant ones are hegemonic, inclusive, hybrid, and then affect, which we're introducing today. The in-class writing that you have to do before Monday, which some of you have noticed on Brightspace, is you simply say, all right, there's 4 models to choose from: hegemonic, inclusive, hybrid, and affect. Which one do I connect with? This isn't saying that the other ones are necessarily wrong. I'm just curious which one you think seems most useful to you as you look at the world, as you think about experiences you've had. You don't have to go into a ton of detail. I just want you to tell me superficially, most just immediately, what seems to connect, because these are tools. Sometimes you'll say, well, it looks like inclusive would be really useful. Sometimes you'll say, no, it's clearly one of the others, right? But what one just immediately do you gravitate towards? Again, you can't be wrong here. I just want you to tell me the one that seems that you seem to connect with on some level, and then tell me why. That's it. So again, you can't get it wrong, but it's your chance to say, okay, we've worked through these 4 things. This one seems useful for me, whether it's looking at media, whether it's looking at social media, whether it's looking at a sports team you're on, whether it's your experience in a subculture, experience in the military, any of those things, right? Which one actually seems useful for you? Okay. Next thing, before we get into the article that Clifton and I wrote, and we're going to try to make sense of that one together. What are the key terms from hybrid masculinity? So we worked through hybrid masculinity. We made it to the end of the reading. But what were the key aspects of that? What would you say? We're going forward to a quiz, but even outside of that pragmatic goal of thinking what would be on the quiz, what are the useful terms, right? So we've got hybrid masculinity following inclusive masculinity, both of them saying there's been these shifts in the world. Inclusive takes a rather positive, optimistic reading of the shifts, saying there's the emergence of multiple masculinities where there's not actually a hierarchy, and that we're seeing the emergence of more inclusive masculinities that accept more emotional performances that would be associated with more a feminine engagement with the world, less policing of sexuality, kind of all these positive, more open developments. So that's what Eric Anderson sees. And you see CJ Pascoe and Tristan Bridges say, well, let's hold up. We're actually adding that hegemonic masculinity, but we don't think things are as positive as Eric Anderson is reading it. So what are the key terms from hybrid masculinity that we should know? Maybe just type them in the chat. That'd be an easy way to do it. And then Joy, I saw your message, which seems to have disappeared, that you're using someone else's computer. And I also see Garrett's message too. Okay, so we got Trevor and Julia responding. We've got discursive distancing, strategic borrowing, fortifying boundaries. Yep, I would say those are three key ones. We've got patriarchal privilege. I would say that just comes from hegemonic masculinity. So in hybrid masculinity, they're also using it, but definitely a term worth understanding. All right, any terms beyond? So we've definitely got the discursive distancing, strategic borrowing, fortifying boundaries. I want to make sure we understand any of those. What else was really key from hybrid masculinity? And then patriarchal privilege is really key for all three of these. Any other term that you see? We got anything else popping up? Privilege, privilege. All right, let's make sure we understand those three terms then. So next thing I'm going to have you type is we have discursive distancing, strategic borrowing, and fortifying boundaries. Which of those three terms would you like to discuss? Type in the chat if there's one of them that you would like to discuss because you don't understand or could use some examples of, and then we can work through them. I'm going to help you help me figure it out. So which of those three, discursive distancing, strategic borrowing, and fortifying boundaries, which of those processes? Because what they're saying, right, is that hybrid masculinity seems like this positive thing. There's actually a danger because it actually masks power. So, and they say these are the three things that we see occurring, those three moves: strategic borrowing, fortifying boundaries, and which one am I forgetting now in my head? Discursive distancing. So which of these do we need to discuss? We've got Felicia saying it would be useful to discuss this, strategic borrowing. So all right, we'll definitely discuss that. Fortifying boundaries. Yeah, I think fortifying boundaries is the one that's that I think is the most confusing in terms of coming up with examples, but we can do that. Now, I will say in my mind, the concept of these that's probably the most useful is discursive distancing, because fortifying boundaries is something that once we've talked through, I don't think we're going to see it as like something new, right? I think you'll understand it. Strategic borrowing, I think we'll also understand because there's a lot of talk of this happening in regards to race and ethnicity. I think discursive distancing is the one that we don't think of as immediately outside of the reading. So we should probably talk about that too. All right, let's start with fortifying boundaries. Does anyone want to take a shot at what that actually means or what it looks like? help me out. I want to make sure, I want to see if one of you can lead our understanding of each of these three, and I'll help you. So who wants to help with fortifying boundaries? What does that mean? Feel free to just jump in if you want.
To me, fortifying boundaries seemed like it was the idea of, I know it mentioned like the third party object to kind of create like very personal like distance, I guess, and kind of take away like, especially in your reading of like the intimacy aspect, it like struck that boundary where like intimacy couldn't exist because it's just in the nature of the sport. It's not in the nature of like desire, like intimacy truly is. So like that fortification of the boundary was ultimately saying that like the rules and the settings that sports provide truly just like distinguish or like distinguish how men interact with each other so that they can create this idea of like promoting hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And that's going to be really important. I'm going to introduce this idea of the triangle when we get to my reading. I think the key parts, does anyone want to add to that answer actually before I jump in? I think the key part there is, in terms of fortifying boundaries, is doing things that seem to break down the expectation of what is allowed in masculinity, right? It's seemingly breaking down, engaging in an act that would, to just kind of repeat the term itself, would erode the boundaries of what's expected, right? That would push towards a more inclusive openness. That's what it seems like. I think last time we talked about the act of um, having more emotion as a father, right? These men's groups of the 80s. We're talking about, well, it's all about opening up, it's about being less closed off, it's about willing to talk about being happy, being able to talk about when you're sad. A lot of movements in the 70s and 80s were doing this with men. So it seems like the boundaries would be eroding. We'd be saying, okay, that seems like it's understanding that everyone can be masculine, everyone can be feminine. And that what CJ Pascoe and Tristan Bridges point out is often it looks like it's going to be this move of opening possibilities of different types of relationships, of different type of communication styles, but it ends up being this place where it's about returning to traditional gendered expectations and norms. So even as you're talking about being a new type of father, you would still say, but it is a new type of father, but it is to be a man and do this thing, right? And it is a man who should be doing this, and almost rescribing gender roles even while you're doing that. So the whole thing about fortifying boundaries is that it's acting in ways that on a superficial level seem like it's opening new possibilities, but then when you pay attention to what's actually going on, not doing that. It's actually reestablishing down. It's creating new boundaries. So it's new, but it's also strong boundaries. It's not just creating an openness. And so the example that you were just giving with my reading about what's happening in sport, we'll talk about that, but it fits that perfectly. So fortifying boundaries, it's about, seems like it could be creating this possibility, this openness, but then it shuts that door, it closes it off. Dressing, it could, example of that would be, a lot of these overlap. Things like strategic borrowing and fortifying boundaries can overlap. All these three processes happen at the same time, but it could be even something like this new fashion norm emerges, which is taking from inspiration from styles that would be associated more with the gay culture. And then people say, okay, that seems like an openness, an expansion of the possibilities of masculinity. But then people doing it, with the men doing it, would say, no, it has nothing to do with that. We just like this style, right? This is actually a way of showing off straight men's bodies, but it's not, we want the audience to be women. It's not for other men. That would be the idea of fortifying boundaries. It seems like this shift, but it actually isn't happening. Make sense? And we could see there's a lot of spaces that happens. Like it seems like there's something going on, and then it actually closes the door. Strategic borrowing. Someone explain that one. This is one that has the most overlap. This is the one that gets a lot of discussion in regards to race and ethnicity. You see a lot of discussion of this on social media. What do we mean by strategic borrowing? There's a word. What's the word that's used other than strategic borrowing? Usually it's when we see white people borrow from other groups' cultures without acknowledging where things are coming from. What's the term that's used? I think that used to be an academic term, but now you actually see, especially your journey, I think generation uses it. Yeah, Grace wrote it, cultural appropriation. It's a very similar idea. It's a group in a position of power borrowing, taking cultural styles, language, fashion, food, norms, anything, taking norms, right, from another group, but not acknowledging the history of that act, not acknowledging the ways that that act actually was maybe punished in the past, or maybe was a source of cultural pride or anything. It's taking it without acknowledging the roots. That's what strategic borrowing is. And again, with hybrid masculinity, that looks potentially like progress, right? Cultural exchange is often something that we celebrate. Cultural openness is often something that's celebrated. But what is being pointed out here is simply taking some aspect from a culture, but not acknowledging what goes on with it, along with it, doesn't actually represent progress, especially when we're thinking about masculinity. The metrosexual movement of the 2000s and 2010, which Eric Anderson pointed to as a sign of openness, Pascoe and Bridges say, well, not necessarily, right? Men using, how many of you have seen marketing campaigns for men's face lotion or chapstick or anything like that? Have any of you ever seen any of these that are actually like hyper masculine ways to get men to use these products? Like there's whole lines of, what's it called? It's called like Warrior something. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? There's actually makeup for men, but it has like a very specific term that's very masculine. But this would be an example. We could find all this type of stuff. Often if there's going to be a product for men like a face lotion, usually it has some sort of name that makes sure that men understand that it's about being masculine, right? You have a specific scent, or the fact that you would have a different lotion that a woman would not use, or B, that's a perfect example of it. Dude wipes. How many of you have heard of dude wipes? Yeah, or that other example, Garrett. Oh yeah, and war paint. War paint was the makeup I was talking about, right? It's called war paint. These are things where you're actually taking from another group, but this also fits with fortifying boundaries, right? You're taking this practice, but that hybridity doesn't mean that you're actually saying, okay, we're opening up the space and we're actually sharing it and having this equal exchange. Rather, it's establishing, no, this is something that a group in power, that hegemonic men can do. Dr. Squatch soap is a really good example. Dude wipes, one of the places that Dude wipes was advertised most often was in MMA, right? So the company was very specific. We are going to make sure that people understand you can do this thing, but you're not going to associate it with women or with gay men. It's about being tough. It's about being masculine. It's about being straight. That's who's going to do this. So we're going to change the name of the product. But it's just because there's a cultural shift happening in terms of presentation of self, it doesn't mean that actually goes along with any sort of progressive politics. That's the point being made. Just because a white person is listening to rap music, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have an understanding of racism, right? It just means that they like that type of culture and they're borrowing some aspect of it. Then the one that I think is most interesting, because I think we kind of know about cultural appropriation. We hear about these things and we can see the challenges of it. We can see fortifying boundaries, discursive distancing. That one's really useful because does anyone want to take a shot at that? And then I want to get to my article so we can get through most of it. What is discursive distancing? The last time I forgot who wrote in the chat, but hashtag not all men is a perfect example of discursive distancing. Someone put that last time and they're correct. What is this whole discursive distancing thing? It's the only one that you didn't write in the chat when I said, which one do I need to explain? And no one wrote discursive distancing. So that means all of you should know that one. Yeah, last time Gabby asked if it was like implicit masculinity. What do you even mean by that?
That basically there's no challenging to hegemonic masculinity from implicit masculinity, just like there's no challenging to the fact that, you know, I'm good, but I'm not doing anything to stop the bad.
Yeah, so why are you saying implicit masculinity? Oh, you're thinking, wait, when you're
Oh,
saying
I just felt
implicit,
like
do
it
you,
was
wait,
like,
wait a second. When you're saying implicit, do you mean complicit? Like the term
is
from
that one
hegemonic
of the 4 ones? I might be
Yes.
saying
Oh, okay.
it
Yes,
wrong.
that's
It was
why.
one
All
of the
right.
4.
Yes. Okay. So when you said implicit masculinity, I was thinking you were using a term from psychology. And that's why I was wondering. That's why I wanted you to explain it. Okay. You mean complicit masculinity. Now it makes sense. It's similar. It's
Yes.
similar. It's a little bit different. It's similar, but different. So the key part, and Grace actually is giving a really good answer in the chat right now. And Trevor's answer is pretty solid too. The difference is with complicit masculinity, it's striving to be that of hegemonic masculinity, realizing that you don't fully achieve it, but still supporting all the ideals of it. That's complicit masculinity. It's maybe you don't have the body type to be seen as hegemonic. Maybe you don't have the job to be seen as hegemonic, but you support the idea of that thing. You still critique the group that's in subordinate masculinity. You still critique marginalized masculinity. You get some of the rewards of hegemonic masculinity, but you're not actually that thing, right? You're sitting on the couch. You don't have that job and you don't get the respect from all the people necessarily, all the other men, but you still say, well, I'm benefiting from this in some way. You still have the patriarchal privilege and you still push down the other groups of types of masculinity. So that's complicit. The difference with discursive distancing is engaging in a seemingly engaging with acts that actually are progressive, doing things that are good, right? And doing things that are good in a sense of pushing against some of the negative pressures of hegemonic masculinity, but then also then using that as a way to say, well, there's bad aspects of masculinity. There's those guys that are bad guys, and I'm a good guy. So I'm not really responsible for any of that stuff. I don't really benefit from any of that stuff. I'm one of the good ones. Right? It's creating that distance and just that separation without actually challenging it. So, or without recognizing the ways that you still could be connected to it. It's not really pushing against any of the bigger structures of power. It's just saying, well, yeah, performative activism is a good way to understand it. It's like doing a good thing, but it's not just performative activism. It's saying, I've engaged in this, so then therefore I am not responsible or I have nothing to do with it. So that's what's happening with discursive distancing. It's using language, creating an argument about why I'm not that thing. And again, none of these things are bad in themselves, but the problem is all of them mask the inequalities that continue to exist in society, right? As there's more cultural exchange, it's harder to just map out the hierarchy of masculinity. It's a lot easier to say, well, we've had this progress in all these areas of society. As people distance to say, well, yeah, that's bad, but a lot of bad stuff happens in progressive spaces, right? Because a lot of people are engaging in the act of discursive distancing, but not actually making any sort of real change. Okay, is that making sense so far? So hybrid masculinity is saying there's these shifts that happen, but there's not as much change as we think. A lot of the change happens on the surface level, and there's not actually some sort of deeper movement. So that's what's going on with hybrid masculinity. So then Clifton and I come along and we try to do something a little bit different, right? So both of us are doing research in communities that are traditionally deemed, to use Eric Anderson's language, as being examples of orthodox masculinity. Clifton is looking at surfing, which is very also on a superficial level, but even beyond a superficial level, a very masculine space. And then I'm looking at mixed martial arts gyms, people who train in MMA. So both of us are looking at these spaces. Generally, both of these spaces are what would be described as homosocial spaces. What that means is same-sex spaces. That's what homosocial means, right? So there are some women who surf, there are some men or some women who train in MMA, but a lot of gyms remain exclusively filled with men. If you go surfing, a lot of beaches are dominated by men, right? So these are both spaces where it's more surprising to see an equal mix of men and women or people of a variety of genders than to just see completely simply men, people who identify as men. So both of these are homosocial spaces. Now, the other thing is both fit the mold of hegemonic masculinity in a lot of ways. They're often relatively affluent spaces, even if surfers themselves do not have a lot of resources at the moment coming from more affluent backgrounds. They're often relatively white spaces. They're relatively heteronormative spaces. They're relatively territorial spaces. So a big part of surfing is claiming a particular beach and almost creating this gang type mentality of protecting that beach against rival surfers. It's a lot of celebration of physique and what the body can do. And it's about skill. And with that skill, with that physique comes hierarchy. Trevor's pointing out happens a lot in Hawaii. Yeah, so Clifton's research is all over Australia. And I think areas surrounding Australia. But yeah, there's a lot of good writing on Hawaii and just like the practice. You've been to Hawaii and seen this type of stuff?
I was raised there, so yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm a native Hawaiian, so I grew up around that culture. So yeah, there's you definitely don't go to certain beaches if you're of a particular nationality or skin color.
Mhm. And also, all right, so you're more of an expert about this than me, because I don't know that much about surf culture outside of just talking to Clifton and like a little bit of traveling. But in terms of, you're saying you don't go to those spaces, what is the threat?
The typically locals will claim certain beaches, typically the ones that usually have the best surf, and to go to those spaces, either you'll be acted aggressively towards, or you'll be punished for trying to get out into the waters, i.e. you'll be run off waves, you'll be berated verbally, maybe even physically, probably physically if you're on land and you're trying to do something. But yeah, it's a space where you generally just avoid unless you're in that community.
Yeah. So this goes back to the point that Connell made, right? How do you enforce this type of stuff? It often turns to violence, whether it's verbal, but it's a threat of physical violence behind it. So, all right. So we see all these ways that these spaces kind of fit this orthodox mentality. And so what Clifton and I do, both of us doing ethnographies, me being in the MMA gym for about 5 years training alongside people, Clifton surfing his whole life, so really conducting a 20-year plus ethnography, is we say, well, in these sites, we're going to see examples, some evidence of all these different types of understandings of masculinity. All those previous dominant models do provide useful tools for understanding it, right? And I can work through those briefly. But we're also seeing some stuff happening that we can't really get at with those previous models. So we're going to propose something else. Now, what we propose is kind of confusing. So first, I think what we want to do is just work through how what we see in the MMA gym, what we see in the surfing community, we could understand it from each of the previous models. And then I want to introduce some terms also to help us there. Then we'll come back to saying, all right, but that thing that you can't get at with those other models, how can we actually get at it from what Clifton and I are proposing? So we'll return to that point. But the first thing is thinking about what we both observed when we're doing our research is, how do we actually understand? How can these other tools be useful for understanding it? First is hegemonic. Lots of evidence in both of these sites of hegemonic masculinity. There's lots of what we describe as the toxic traits of masculinity. Like we were just saying, violence, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, this territorial aspect, that's occurring in these spaces. The other thing that we're seeing occur, and this goes back to the point that was made earlier, I think Kathleen was the one who made it, about this idea of the third object. We see this happening over and over. And this is this classic thing you see in homosocial spaces with traditional Orthodox masculinity. It's the idea of the third object. And so take some notes on this. This is a useful thing to know. This is this classic idea. It actually came from queer theory from a scholar, Eve Sedgwick. You don't need to know that Eve Sedgwick was the person who came up with it. But if you go into cultural studies, if you go into gender studies or queer theory, Eve Sedgwick is a name that you should know. So she has the concept of what she calls the homosocial triangle. And what she says is, and I think we can think of a lot of examples of this, is oftentimes in these sites that are dominated by men, and this is in contrast to sites dominated by women, is that you'll see these levels of intensity, of connection and emotion. And instead of those just being directed towards each other, because these are sites of excitement, of intimacy, instead they're always directed towards a third object as a way of pushing away the potential that this could be read as desire for each other. So a classic example would be, think about the syllabus. One of the pictures that we looked at early in the semester was a group of 3 men walking down the street, and we have a woman going the other way. And I'm saying, well, how do we interpret this? And a lot of you talked about catcalling and the different comments that could be made. And then I said, but who's that actually being done for? And almost immediately we had a bunch of you saying it's actually being done for the other men than rather for the woman in the site. That would be an example of directing attention towards this third object, towards women. And it could be literally a woman being right there. Or if you've been in a place like an MMA gym, a place like surfing, there's a lot of conversation of women who are not there, how to meet women, who went home with a woman, what type of woman people find desirable. That's this third object that the excitement is oriented towards, just to make sure, just to establish, right? There's these intimate connections being formed, but there's this third object happening. It also happens through games or through sport. You'll see guys more likely to have conversations, open conversations, while they're shooting a basketball, but it's actually about the conversation that's happening, but there's this third object it's being directed towards, or being at the bar and watching the football game, right? There's always this third thing. So what Eve Sedgwick is pointing out is the way emotion works among spaces that are filled with men is there's often some other thing that's directed. In contrast, with women, there can be that intimate connection, that emotional homosocial relationship, and it doesn't struggle to exist without it carrying sexual overtones, right? There's not as much of this question or need to establish that it's not that thing, right? So that's the idea of the homosocial triangle. And both Clifton and I saw that in these spaces, right? So it'd be really easy to approach surfing and MMA from the perspective of hegemonic masculinity and simply say, these are sites to claim masculinity or to reclaim masculinity. It's a bunch of guys hanging out and establishing their identities through the practice, right? That would be one way to read it. We could read surfing and MMA as a kind of frontier masculinity in a sense. People claiming their control over nature, or in the sense of the MMA gym, claiming this kind of tough, rugged masculinity through learning how to fight and demonstrating their ability to fight. That would be one way to read the site. If someone read those sites in that way, I wouldn't say they're wrong. I think there's elements of it. Then we say, so that makes sense. Then we say we could also read it in some ways as a place of inclusive masculinity. It'll be a little bit harder, but a lot of people in the gym, in the MMA gym, were kind of accepting and supported things like women's rights, or when gay marriage passed, most of the people in the gym were accepting of it. But we also saw on the smaller scale, they weren't that inclusive sites, right? So there were places where there was an emphasis to establish that people were straight. So I mean, there's some elements of inclusive masculinity, but we didn't see that as a dominant way to understand it. We also saw it as a way where you could argue that it was about hybrid masculinity. We saw a lot of softer performances, right? So people having conversations about work, having conversations about different diets, having conversations about things going well in their life, things going not so well in their life. And we also saw, and this is a term that is useful to know that Tristan Bridges did not use in the article I had you read, but he's associated with this term called gender capital. And other people use this term as well. So this is the idea that if you accrue you kind of accrue points that go along with gender performance. So if you're seen as particularly masculine, if you're engaging in activities that are read as very masculine, it gives you gender capital. And that allows you to also do things that could be seen as less masculine. So we're saying, okay, so in the surf community, in the MMA gym, you're engaging in this very masculine act. So it opens up the ability to do those softer type of performances. You accrue enough gender capital that people won't immediately call into question and say, well, you're not being manly enough, right? So you could easily read the gym and the surf community as that. So we're saying all of these kind of make sense, right? So it's a good way to review what each of those models tell us to expect. You following along so far? I'm going kind of fast, but I'm just using this because what we do in the beginning of the article is just review those three dominant approaches and say, yeah, it kind of works, but it doesn't perfectly work. So we all get what those three approaches are and what they do. Because you can imagine if I were doing the in-class writing, I might say, okay, I'm training in MMA. Which of these models actually works with what I'm seeing in the world? And you could answer using any of those three. But then what we say is there's something else going on in the gym that's really hard to get at from any of those three models. And what we want to do is come up with a model that better gets at the experience or process of being in these sites, right? And what these guys actually share with each other and often what they seek out. And a big part of what's happening is we see all these exchanges of emotional openness. We see a lot of things where people are touching each other, engaging in these soft performances. We actually see vulnerability as one of the things that people are seeking out in these sites and miss the most when they leave these sites behind. Now, that doesn't mean that the sites end up being this space of just like breaking down the boundaries, but there's moments where that happens. So even if it ends up reifying what's expected with orthodox masculinity, it's also a potential place for intervention, right? And one of the things that Clifton and I say, and this is where we end the article, is that should be one of the goals of scholars, right? If we're simply mapping out typologies of masculinity, great, that's useful. That can be a way of understanding the world. But what we're looking for is the moments where that breaks down, where we think as scholars, where you could actually interrupt and say, hey, point out to the people in the site, look, there's a different path that this could go. So one of our goals in this article is to also think about the possibility for intervention. But on a basic level, we want to say, hey, we're seeing all this stuff, all these moments that don't follow the categories, that don't follow just the typologies. How do we get at that stuff? Trevor just wrote the banal and mundane. Yeah, I want to return to that concept in a little bit because that's really important for the article. But the other thing that we're doing is, in a sense, we're critiquing. There was a move that happened following hegemonic masculinity, Connell's ideas, as it became more and more popular, where the goal of research would just be to come up with a new term, a new label for a type of masculinity. We saw that with frontier masculinity. Again, that can be useful, but then what would happen is, say, let me just choose one of you. Say Julie wants to go into being a scholar who studies gender, specifically masculinity. Julie's goal, a good way to publish an article, a good way to get known, would be Julie would find a group of men and study them and then say, this is the type of masculinity they are performing, and come up with a new term for it. So Julie would say, I don't know, either Julie or someone else, name like a group of guys that she could study. Either like location or like subculture, just help me out. Anything. Type it in the chat or say it. E-boys. What's an e-boy? I don't know what that even means. Yeah, stoners work. Now I'm just curious what an e-boy is, though. But I'll use Gabby's because I actually know that better. Is that like an electronic boy? Let's use stoners. So Julie would research stoner masculinity. Oh, like chronically online guy. That makes sense. Okay, so Julie decides to research stoner masculinity. Gabby's helping, and so they do some research and they just come up with a term like stoner masculinity, and they look at how within that culture there's a certain type of masculine performance, and then they would talk about how that fits into that mapping out of hegemonic, complicit, subordinate, or marginalized. Right? That would be the research. And Clifton and I say, great. So there's all these different types of masculinity, but there's two things that's missing. One is, again, it gets away from the actual experience of what's going on in these sites, because people in the sites are not just trying to like fit into that map. So there's something lost there. We want to understand what it actually feels like, what actually occurs in these sites. But the other thing is, if we're so obsessed with coming up with all these typologies, maybe we're missing out on this idea that there's this thing, masculinity, that is, we need some sort of uniform thing. If we're using the term masculinity, masculinity needs to be this thing that affects everyone, right? And it can affect everyone in different ways. But if we're just talking about all these different groups, what are we actually doing? So we can talk about lumberjack masculinity, we can talk about stoner masculinity, we can talk about e-boy masculinity. We can, like, what is it actually doing other than just coming up with new terms? So that was our concern. And we're in these sites and we're like, all right, so we could talk about surfer masculinity and MMA masculinity, but we're actually seeing something very similar in both sites. And we're also seeing the potential disruption of masculine expectations. So what we argue is we can treat masculinity as a style or affect. Now, this is the part where it gets a little bit theoretical and a little bit potentially confusing. So what do we mean by affect? Does anyone know the term? Has anyone heard the term affect before in another class or in another, even like, what does it even mean, affect? I want to try. And I'm just curious if you've heard that term before. Yeah, I know. When you're actually writing, the difference between effect and affect is confusing. And as you go on in academia, it actually gets more confusing because the rule you learn about it, about how to differentiate between the two, actually disappears. It isn't even correct. So affect could be thought of as, oh yeah, Trevor, really good. That's a great answer. So that's how it's understood in psychology and why it has value in sociology too. Wait, why do you know that? Oh, Google. All right. I was like, you just gave an incredibly good answer and it was very well spelled out. I was impressed by that. Trevor's answer is correct from Google. So it's it's trying to get at the actual experience that we have with our bodies, right? So taking seriously emotions, or even taking something seriously that's more foundational than emotion. So let's think about an example of emotion. Fear is an emotion, right? But what are the things that happen that before we even label it as fear? How would we describe, everyone imagine being afraid. Tell me what it's like tell me what happens in your body. Tell me what you feel. Like, just type it in, type free associate fear. What's fear feel like? Yeah, stop. All right, keep going. Okay, be more descriptive of fight or flight though, even before that. That's actually a decision that you make, even if you don't consciously make it. Heart rate goes up. You might get a little bit sweaty. The hair in the back of your neck might go up, right? Your stomach might get in knots. There's different types of fear, but you have there's something happening and it affects your body. It has an affect on you. This is why affect and effect are confusing. It has an affect on you. It does something to you, right? It could be you're watching a scary movie. It could be you're going on a roller coaster, which you're having a very same experience, but instead of fear, you might call it excitement, right? There's a lot of overlap between fear and excitement, right? There's all these different ways that things affect and guide our body. That's also very similar to emotions. But with emotions, the reason that affect is thought of, to use Trevor's language from Google, a pre-conscious form of emotion, is yet they don't yet have a label, right? The thing that when we call it fear, when we call it excitement, when we call it love, when we call it happiness, when we call it jealousy, all those are social ways to describe what's happening to our body. Very similar. Affect and emotion are very similar. People who study sociology of emotions and sociology of affect, we kind of cluster together, but emotion is already giving a label to it. So what we're trying to do when we're understanding masculinity from the perspective of affect is, what does this stuff actually feel like? How does it actually play out in these sites? And then the other thing, when you're studying affect, the most basic question we ask, and this is kind of, it seems kind of confusing or maybe spiritual at first or something, is basically, what can the body do? And what you're asking by that is, in these social experiences that we have, how does it guide the possibilities of what our body actually does or can do? right? There's some things that we could think about masculinity as this giant affect, meaning it attaches to certain bodies and attaches to bodies in different way, and it guides the experience or feelings that we'll have, right? Think about that list we had on the board. A lot of those things that we listed were ways that it actually closes off the experience or emotions that someone is masculine. It kind of mutes certain experiences and emotions, and it magnifies or guides other ones, right? Something like risk, something like this idea of like hardness, this idea of anger or aggression, right? It guides you towards acting certain ways, and it guides you away from acting other ways. So with approaching masculinity from this perspective, saying there's this thing that's up there, there's a social thing that has power, and when does it attach to bodies? What bodies is it attached to, and what does it actually do? What does it allow, and what does it not allow? This is all pretty theoretical so far. Are you still following along, kind of? So we can pick up this next time because we're about to run out of time, but I just want to get through this idea. So what you're seeing in the site itself and some of the examples, especially the examples that Clifton was giving, he gives this example of how, you know, when you're about to surf or you're about this experience and the hair on the back of your neck goes up, or you're like you have these different emotions, and then other people in the site help explain what you just experienced, right? It's an easiest. How many of you have heard the term Mobius strip? Anyone heard that term? Okay, before class next time, and I'm going to email this out, I want you to all look up the image of a Mobius strip. And we're going to start off next class, and I'll explain how Mobius strip is so key to understanding the way affect understands culture. Because it's a central concept for understanding it. Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit more within the 3 minutes before we run out of time. So if we're looking at masculinity through this perspective of affect, we're getting away from mapping different types, and instead we're saying there's this giant force that can push us in certain ways, and it impacts certain people and more than it impacts other people, right? And we're trying to understand those moments that you actually break through it, and the moments where it actually attaches and guides you. So in the site itself, what we're seeing, right? There's these kind of masculine interpretations of the site. But partially what's happening is the excitement, the experience of whether it's surfing, whether it's being in the MMA gym, that excitement creates openings, and it kind of breaks through some of the closures that masculinity generally has, right? So in those moments after people train together and they're punching each other and they're kicking each other and they're learning how to choke each other, or the moment where you just catch a big wave, right? In those moments right after, what follows is a potential openness. Suddenly those closures of masculinity that we listed on the board are broken away, and you see the excitement of people rapidly talking to each other, talking about their emotional states, sharing the feeling of uncertainty or excitement. There's this openness and this connection that masculinity often closes off, right? There's a intimacy, there's a feeling of sharing, there's a lot of people, this whole idea that you feel closer to each other, people that you train with or that you have. This is that breaking through of closures. So that's part of what we're trying to learn that you can't get at with those other approaches. This goes, and this is the final, potentially like Fight Club. We'll talk about that. Keep that example for next time, Julia. This brings, I'm going to final point here. We got 1 minute. I'll bring this up, and then we'll return to make sure we understand it. What Trevor wrote in the chat, he said the banal or the mundane. This is a methodological point that Clifton and I are making. We're saying oftentimes when people try to understand masculinity, not only do they have this kind of circular argument where they simply understand masculinity as what men do, and then what men do necessarily makes it masculine, is they just focus on those moments that seem also to be the most masculine. So there's this whole circular thing going on, right? You want to study fighting, you want to study surfing, focus only on those moments that Trevor talked about when the territory is enforced. Or in MMA, focus on the moments of the most aggression and the most physicality. And what we're saying is focus on everything that goes around it. Focus on when people are sitting around and talking to each other. Focus on the moments where people are waiting for to catch the big wave and just sharing things about their life or sharing support of each other. All right, we're going to stop there. We're going to pick up next time, and I'm going to try to make us better understand what we mean by focusing on masculinity as affect or style and where that gets us, as well as potential weaknesses. We'll also talk about how that raises, again, possibilities for intervention, because one of the things that Clifton and I agree on is that too often scholars are focused so much on categorization and understanding that they forget what are the goals of actually studying this thing, and why we both think intervention is a key aspect. So we're going to pick up, we're going to pick up there next time. Then we'll get into, I'll lecture a little bit about the influence of queer theory and understanding female masculinity. And that's going to carry us through basically the whole week. We're going to read 3 articles that all take that approach in some way. So that's where we're at. I will email out a reminder of the stuff you have to do before next class. Hopefully that made some sense, and we will see what was confusing and how to clarify those things on Monday. And we will be meeting in person on Monday. I'm allowed back on campus. Quarantine's over. I should be feeling even better by then as well. So that is the plan. I hope you all have a good weekend. Stick around if you have any questions.